The pattern is so common that most people who live with it never stop to wonder whether it could be any different. Things are going well, objectively well. No visible crisis, no urgent problem, no concrete sign that anything is about to change. And yet, somewhere deep within the system, there is a quiet expectation, subtle but constant, a kind of internal stance that says, any moment now, as if your current well-being were less a reality and more an interval between problems. As if the absence of bad news didn't mean things were okay, but simply that the bad news hadn't arrived yet. Do you recognize that? That specific feeling of waiting for something bad to happen on an afternoon when nothing bad is happening, of never being able to fully relax during a peaceful season because the peace itself feels suspicious, of feeling okay while silently scanning the horizon for the sign that it's all about to end. Most people who live with this pattern interpret it as a form of generalized anxiety, or as a naturally pessimistic personality, as though there were something fundamentally negative about the way they see life. But what decades of research in cognitive psychology show is that this isn't a personality trait. It's a mechanism with identifiable components, traceable origins, and an internal logic that makes perfect sense, even when the outcome it produces is the exact opposite of what the person wants. Psychiatrist Beck at the University of Pennsylvania is considered one of the most influential figures in 20th century psychology. In the late 1950s, while working with patients experiencing emotional distress, Beck began noticing something the dominant theories of the time couldn't fully explain. His patients weren't suffering only because of painful emotions. They were suffering because of specific thoughts, fast, automatic, and often invisible even to themselves, that appeared before the emotions and shaped them. Beck called these negative automatic thoughts. What he documented was that these thoughts were not the result of deliberate analysis. They were automatic predictions, generated by the brain's processing system before conscious evaluation, about what situations meant, what the future would bring, and what other people were thinking. One of the most consistent categories Beck identified involved negative predictions about the future. The system automatically and pre-consciously generated expectations that something bad was going to happen, not as a rational analysis of actual probabilities, but as a reflexive style of processing. The very first interpretation the system produced whenever a situation felt ambiguous or uncertain. And ambiguity and uncertainty are the default conditions of the future. The future is, by definition, always uncertain, which means that for a system that automatically generates negative predictions, the future becomes a permanent source of potential confirmation for those expectations. But where does this tendency to generate negative predictions automatically come from? Why do some people reach adulthood with this style of processing already installed, while others, facing the very same objective situations, arrive at entirely different predictions? Part of the answer comes from decades of research conducted by Harvard psychologist Jerome Kagan, who followed children from the very beginning of life. Kagan identified a temperamental pattern he called behavioral inhibition. Children with high behavioral inhibition responded to new, uncertain, or unfamiliar situations with greater activation of the nervous system, showing more caution, a stronger tendency to withdraw, and taking longer to approach what was unfamiliar. This pattern could be measured within the first months of life. Kagan then followed these children over many years and found that early behavioral inhibition was associated with greater sensitivity to threat and a stronger tendency to expect negative outcomes in new or ambiguous situations later in life. The implication is important. For some nervous systems, the tendency to interpret uncertainty as a potential sign of danger wasn't learned through specific traumatic experiences. It was already present as a temperamental sensitivity from the very beginning, and over time, life experiences either amplified or softened that sensitivity depending on what the environment consistently confirmed. A highly behaviorally inhibited child who grows up in a sufficiently safe and predictable environment may carry that sensitivity as a quiet background characteristic, present but not dominant. The very same child, growing up in an environment marked by unpredictability, instability, or repeated signals that bad things could happen without warning, may have that sensitivity amplified until it becomes the brain's default way of processing the future. And once that processing style becomes the default, it no longer feels like a temporary state. It begins to feel like reality itself. not as a lens through which the future is being viewed, but as the future itself. That's why negative expectation is so difficult to recognize from the inside. It doesn't arrive saying, "I'm being pessimistic right now." It arrives saying, "This is simply how things work." But there's something Beck never fully explained in his description of negative automatic thoughts. Why do some people develop them much more strongly than others, regardless of their original temperament? And why, when faced with the exact same ambiguous situation, does one person's brain consistently generate the most threatening interpretation available? The answer lies in an information processing mechanism that Andrew Mathews, at the University of Cambridge, documented with a level of precision that completely changes how we understand this pattern. Andrew Mathews spent decades at the MRC Cognition and Brain Sciences Unit in Cambridge studying one very specific question. Why do people who are prone to anxiety and negative expectation process the very same information differently from people who are not? What his research revealed wasn't simply that anxious people pay more attention to threats, which was already well known. It uncovered something more subtle and far more revealing about the mechanism that creates negative expectation. Mathews found that anxious nervous systems automatically and preconsciously generate more negative interpretations of ambiguous situations and create more negative mental images of what might happen in the future. The word ambiguous is crucial here. Situations that are clearly good or clearly bad don't depend very much on how the brain processes them. They are what they are. But most situations in everyday life aren't clear. An email from your boss that simply says, "Can we talk?" with no further context. A pause in an important conversation that lasts a little longer than usual. Medical test results that haven't arrived yet. A meeting scheduled without an agenda. In situations like these, the interpretation your brain produces isn't determined by the situation itself. It's determined by the processing system. And according to Mathews, the anxious system interprets ambiguity in the direction of threat, not because it chooses to be pessimistic, but because the system responsible for producing the first interpretation, the fast, preconscious one, has been calibrated to generate that kind of prediction. Think about that email saying, "Can we talk?" For a nervous system that isn't biased toward negative expectation, the first interpretation might simply be, "They probably need something." Neutral, manageable. For a system calibrated toward negative expectation, the first interpretation is, "Something is wrong," and every thought that follows begins from that initial assumption as though it were already a fact. Mathews also documented that this processing doesn't only affect how the present situation is interpreted, it also shapes how the future is imagined. When faced with uncertainty, anxious systems generate more detailed and more negative mental images of what could happen. Not simply, "This could go badly," but vivid scenes of how it would go badly, the consequences, the people involved, their reactions, the entire unfolding of the event, and detailed mental images of negative events activate the brain's threat response system in ways remarkably similar to real events. The nervous system doesn't fundamentally distinguish between "I'm imagining something bad" and "something bad is happening." It responds to the content of the image itself, which means that negative expectation doesn't produce only psychological anticipation. It produces real physiological activation before anything has actually happened. Psychologist Graham Davey at the University of Sussex arrived at the same pattern from a different direction. He spent years studying worry, not as a symptom, but as a process. And what he discovered completely challenges the idea that worrying about bad things is irrational. For most people who do it, worrying is entirely rational, because the hidden assumption behind worry isn't, "This will probably happen." It's a deeper belief, "If I worry about this, I'll be prepared when it happens." And in stronger forms, "If I worry about this, maybe I can prevent it from happening." Davey described this pattern as worry as a problem-solving strategy. The brain treats anticipating problems as a form of risk management. And that perspective has a direct consequence for negative expectation. If expecting something to go wrong is, at the level of the nervous system, a way of preparing, then stopping that expectation would feel, within the same logic, like giving up protection. Negative expectation doesn't feel like pessimism to the person experiencing it. It feels like responsibility. It feels like prudence. It feels like the sensible behavior of someone who understands that things can change and wants to be ready when they do. That's why negative expectation persists even after someone has intellectually understood that it has no rational basis in the present moment. Knowing there's no reason to expect something bad right now doesn't undo the deeper belief that worrying is protective. That belief operates at a different level from conscious understanding. Think about how this shows up in an ordinary situation. Someone has finally achieved financial stability after years of struggle. Objectively, the bills are paid, savings are in place, there is no immediate danger, and yet they continue mentally calculating the worst-case scenario. They keep checking their bank balance even though they already know what they'll find. They keep preparing for a loss that hasn't happened, not because they're being irrational. Because at some point, over a long enough period of time, the nervous system learned that being unprepared for the worst was more dangerous than living in a constant state of preparation. That negative expectation functioned as protection, and abandoning it would therefore feel like becoming vulnerable. If this describes something you've experienced, that feeling that expecting the worst is simply what responsible people do, this channel exists to put a name to that exact pattern. Subscribe so the next video is already waiting for you. But one important piece is still missing. Because what Mathews and Davy describe explains how the system generates and maintains negative expectation. What it still doesn't fully explain is why, even when the feared situation never happens, even when the worst-case scenario repeatedly fails to materialize, the system doesn't seem to learn from that experience the way it should. Why does it keep expecting the worst after surviving, completely unharmed, dozens of situations where the worst never arrived? The answer lies in one of the most thoroughly documented and most counterintuitive phenomena in the psychology of anxiety. Researcher Arnoud Arntz at the University of Amsterdam conducted a series of studies examining what happens when feared situations never actually occur, and what that absence teaches the nervous system. At first glance, the answer seems obvious. If you expect something bad to happen, it doesn't happen, and that pattern repeats over and over, the system should update its prediction. It should learn that the feared outcome is less likely than it originally estimated. But what Arntz documented is that this update is consistently much smaller than it should be, what he called fear over prediction. The tendency to overestimate both the likelihood and the severity of negative events doesn't simply disappear when those predicted events fail to occur. The estimated probability of the next negative event decreases a little, but nowhere near as much as the evidence would justify. Why? Because a system that uses worry as protection, what Graham Davey described as worry as a problem-solving strategy, already has an explanation for why the worst never happened. It wasn't because the worst wasn't going to happen. It was because I was prepared, because I stayed alert, because I never let my guard down. The safety behaviors, the constant vigilance, the endless preparation for the worst, receive the credit for the absence of the feared event. And as long as those safety behaviors receive the credit, the belief that vigilance is necessary is never truly tested. The system doesn't learn that it was overestimating the risk. It learns that its protective strategy worked, and the next time uncertainty appears, that strategy must be maintained. From the outside, this pattern can seem irrational. The person has clearly survived many situations they feared. They've accumulated plenty of evidence that things are often not as bad as they expected, but that evidence never truly updates the expectation because the expectation isn't being maintained by a lack of contradictory evidence. It's being maintained by the belief that vigilance is the reason contradictory evidence exists in the first place. Researchers Charles Carver and Michael Shire at the University of Miami arrived at the phenomenon of negative expectation from a different direction, studying what they called dispositional pessimism. Dispositional pessimism, as Carver and Shire define it, isn't simply being in a bad mood. It's a stable expectation that negative outcomes are more likely, a lens through which the future is consistently processed as more likely to contain problems than successes. What their extensive research revealed is that this expectation has very specific behavioral consequences. People with high levels of negative expectation tend to adopt more passive coping strategies when facing challenges. Instead of actively engaging with a problem, they're more likely to disengage, avoid it, or minimize its importance because expecting a negative outcome reduces the sense that effort will make any difference. Why bother trying if it's probably not going to work anyway? But perhaps the most important finding from Carver and Shire concerns how negative expectation sustains itself. The passive strategies produced by dispositional pessimism often lead to poorer outcomes, not because people lack the ability, but because expecting failure leads to behaviors that actually increase the likelihood of failure, which quietly confirms exactly what the system predicted. See, I knew it would go wrong. And every confirmation, even when it's partly created by the very behavior the expectation produced, feeds the next cycle of negative expectation. Think about how this works in relationships. Someone who expects that people will eventually disappoint them may begin keeping an emotional distance in order to protect themselves from that disappointment. But that distance can easily be interpreted by the other person as coldness, disinterest, or a lack of investment in the relationship, which may genuinely cause the other person to pull away, and that becomes confirmation. People always end up leaving me. Or consider a professional setting. Someone who expects not to be recognized may present their work with visible uncertainty. They may fail to advocate for what they've accomplished. They may withdraw precisely in the situations where they most need to speak up, which can result in receiving less recognition, and that becomes confirmation. I'm never appreciated the way I should be. Negative expectation doesn't merely predict a difficult future. It actively participates in creating that future through the behaviors it produces. And that's what makes it so difficult to undo through reasoning alone, because the rational thought that says things could turn out differently is working against a structure that doesn't simply predict negative outcomes. It often finds real-world confirmation of those predictions, even when that confirmation has been partly created by the system itself. The cost of this pattern extends far beyond the specific events it anticipates. It is, fundamentally, temporal. Negative expectation creates anticipatory suffering, the partial experience of a painful event before it has actually happened, and often before there's any meaningful chance that it ever will. Over months and years, that anticipatory suffering can amount to an enormous quantity of emotional pain generated by events that never actually occurred. Not because of carelessness, not because of needless pessimism, but because the nervous system learned that anticipating the worst was safer than not anticipating it. And that final idea changes everything about how this pattern can be understood. The system isn't simply expecting the worst. At some point in its history, expecting the worst genuinely made sense. There was a real logic behind that calibration, and that logic became so deeply embedded that it continued operating even after the environment that once justified it no longer existed. There's a way of understanding negative expectation that completely changes what becomes possible to do with it. Not as a character flaw, not as faulty thinking, but as calibration. Every calibration begins with an environment. The system learns, through repeated experience, how that environment usually behaves, and it generates expectations that match what it has learned. For a system that grew up, or spent enough time, in an environment where bad things happened often, without warning, and frequently without anything that could have been done to prevent them, negative expectation is not a distortion. It is a reasonably accurate reading of the environment it experienced. The problem is not that the system learned the wrong lesson. The problem is that it learned within one context, and kept applying that learning to different contexts because calibrations do not automatically update simply with the passage of time. They update through evidence that is processed differently from the way safety behaviors allow. Evidence that the environment now works differently, that the absence of vigilance does not lead to dangerous surprises, that silence does not necessarily come before abandonment, that peaceful days can simply be peaceful days. But that evidence has to be experienced without the protective behaviors that prevent it from being processed as evidence, without the vigilance that credits safety to vigilance itself, without the worry that concludes the worst didn't happen because it was anticipated. And that is profoundly difficult, not because it requires discipline or willpower, but because the very system that would need to open itself to this evidence is the same system that developed negative expectation as a response to environments where opening up without protection carried a real cost. The contradiction is real. The way forward is not to force the system to abandon its protection, but to gradually create conditions in which contradictory evidence can be received without requiring that protection to be completely discarded. Not all at once, in small doses, through experiences where the worst did not happen, and where the system cannot explain that outcome by crediting its own vigilance, because that vigilance was partially absent. With enough repetition, the calibration begins to adjust. Not dramatically, not permanently all at once, but genuinely, as the system's internal database gradually accumulates evidence that the world now functions differently from the one it originally learned. Subscribe to follow what comes next on this channel, because the next video takes this story into a dimension that goes beyond negative expectation as a mental state, and into something even deeper. Automatic negative thoughts, a central concept in the cognitive model developed by Beck at the University of Pennsylvania, describe rapid, automatic, pre-conscious predictions generated by the brain before any deliberate evaluation takes place. In the context of negative expectation, these predictions consistently take the form of anticipating negative outcomes, not as the result of conscious analysis, but as the automatic output of a system calibrated in that direction. Behavioral inhibition, documented by Jerome Kagan at Harvard through decades of longitudinal research, describes a temperamental pattern of heightened reactivity to novelty and uncertainty, present from the earliest months of life and associated, over time, with a greater tendency to interpret ambiguity as a potential threat. Negative expectation may therefore have temperamental roots that precede any specific life experience. Negative interpretation bias, studied by Mathews at the MRC Cognition and Brain Sciences Unit in Cambridge, shows that anxious systems automatically generate more negative interpretations of ambiguous situations and more negative mental images of possible futures than non-anxious systems facing the exact same objective circumstances. Ambiguity is processed in the direction of threat as the system's first response, before conscious evaluation has the opportunity to intervene. Worry as a problem-solving strategy, described by Graham Davey at the University of Sussex, suggests that worry and negative expectation are sustained in part by the implicit belief that anticipating the worst is a way of preparing for, or even preventing, negative outcomes. This makes negative expectation feel less like pessimism and more like responsibility, and it makes the absence of worry feel like vulnerability rather than freedom. Fear over prediction, documented by Arnoud Arntz at the University of Amsterdam, shows that anxious systems consistently predict negative events as being both more likely and more severe than they actually turn out to be, and that these predictions fail to update proportionally when the feared events never occur, because safety behaviors receive the credit for the absence of the feared outcome. Dispositional optimism and pessimism, extensively studied by Charles Carver and Michael Shire at the University of Miami, describe stable expectations about future outcomes that shape behavior in predictable ways. Persistent negative expectations often lead to passive coping strategies, which can contribute to poorer outcomes, quietly reinforcing the very expectations that produced them. Negative expectation doesn't merely predict a difficult future, it actively participates, through the behaviors it generates, in creating that future. If any part of this video described something you recognize in yourself, that quiet expectation that something is about to go wrong, that difficulty fully believing things are actually okay, leave a comment. Just one word. Whatever stayed with you. Because recognizing the internal logic of negative expectation is the first step toward building a different relationship with it. But there's something about negative expectation that becomes even more revealing after years of living this way. Expecting something to go wrong isn't just a mental state. It becomes a way of inhabiting time, a posture toward the future that, with enough repetition, gradually becomes part of who the system believes it is. The person who always expects the worst isn't simply processing the future in a certain way. They are quietly building an identity around that posture, an identity that knows hardship, that knows how to manage crisis, that is always prepared for what might happen. And once that identity becomes deeply established, something curious and deeply unsettling begins to happen. Peace no longer feels merely uncomfortable. It starts to feel unfamiliar, as though it doesn't belong to this person, as though it exists for other people, for those whose histories are different, whose nervous systems were calibrated differently, but not for them. It's not that peace is unwanted. It's that it no longer feels recognizable as something that belongs to the identity that has been built. Why can peace feel not only uncomfortable, but genuinely foreign? And what does the nervous system need in order to begin recognizing peace not simply as the absence of problems, but as a state that belongs to it as well? If you've stayed with me until this point, the next video was made for you.